was talking to him. He was 15 miles from the land. So, Phil, I understand you had him visually and on the radar, and you lost him in both respects. No, I didn't have him visually. I had him on the radar. He was exactly 10 miles ahead of us. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that.
2 weeks after the Edmund Fitzgerald and the 29 men on board went missing on November 10th, 1975, Gordon Lightfoot read 2 articles covering the tragedy, one by Harry Atkins in the LA Times, the other by Jim Gain in Newsweek. Lightfoot was a sailor himself and a child of the lakes. He was immediately captivated. He imagined that fateful night, the fierce November gale, and a wave massive enough to take down the mighty Fitz. He realized that he needed to memorialize those 29 men the only way that he knew how, by writing a song. Soon a proper sea shanty melody echoed in his head. He gathered every newspaper he could find covering the sinking and painstakingly reconstructed the details of that fateful night. Then he began to write lyrics. 478 words, just 56 shy of the Newsweek article that inspired him. He had a song, but he was filled with doubt. Was it his place to tell this story? Was it exploitative? What would the families of the victims think? Lightfoot wrestled with these questions for months. Finally, in the spring of 1976, it was time to record his next album. Lightfoot gathered bassist Rick Haynes, guitarist Terry Clemens and Pee Wee Charles, and drummer Barry Keane at the Eastern Sound Studios at 48 Yorkville Avenue in downtown Toronto to lay down the tracks for Summertime Dream. The band had already rehearsed every song but one. Whenever they got to the Edmund Fitzgerald, Lightfoot shook his head, and they moved on to something else. Now that it was time to record, Lightfoot doubted that the song would ever make it to the album, or even be recorded at all. They had the studio for 5 days. One by one, they recorded each track. When they came to that song, Lightfoot said it wasn't ready. Finally, after 3.5 days, they had recorded every song but one. It looked as if they were done. The song would go unrecorded. Just as the band began to pack up their instruments, the studio engineer, Kenny Friesen, hit the talk button in the recording booth and asked if they were going to record the Shipwreck song. Lightfoot shook his head and said no. But Friesen reminded him that they had the studio for another day and a half. They were paying for it either way. Might as well give it a go. Lightfoot considered. Then he nodded and said all right. The band had never played the song together, and no one was quite sure how it would go. Lightfoot told the guitarists to do their thing, and he told Keane on the drums to come in at his signal. Everyone knew that this song was different. The lights were dimmed. Lightfoot closed his eyes, and he began to play his guitar. He wouldn't bring in the drums until 1 minute and 34 seconds, right when the lyrics signaled the first winds of the storm. No one knew what the song was supposed to sound like, but somehow, everything came together perfectly. Over the next day, they recorded it 3 or 4 more times, but nothing quite captured the magic of that initial playthrough. That first take is the one on the album. Everyone knew that it was special, but no one could have imagined that that strange modern sea shanty, an elegiac memorial to an unknown, ill-fated lake freighter and the 29 men on board, would be a hit. The song reached number 1 in Canada and number 2 in the Billboard Hot 100 chart in the United States. Gordon Lightfoot considered it to be his finest work. Unlike the many articles that came and went, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald captured the imagination and immortalized the tragedy. Today, 50 years after that fateful night, the memory of the Edmund Fitzgerald and the 29 men who lost their lives is stronger than ever, partly thanks to that strange little song that Gordon Lightfoot almost never recorded. On the evening of November 10th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald sank on Lake Superior. Not a single one of the 29 men on board survived the night. There was no distress signal or call for help. The massive freighter simply vanished from radar screens while battling a fierce November gale. It was far from the first tragedy on the Great Lakes. It wasn't even the deadliest. The Lady Elgin took over 300 lives. The Eastland claimed 844. The Fitz wasn't the greatest mystery either. The Bannockburn vanished without a trace in 1902, and to this day, her wreck has never been found. Her fate remains unknown. But still, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald has taken on a life of its own. Each of the 5 Great Lakes has its own reputation and its fair share of storied wrecks, but none have reached the infamy of Lake Superior. The Ojibwe people called it Gitche Gumee, which roughly translates to the Great Sea. French explorers called it Le Lac Supérieur, the Upper Lake. That name stuck. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, and the 3rd largest by volume. It holds 2,900 cubic miles of water, 13% of the world's fresh water. While for centuries indigenous tribes used the lake for fishing, travel, and trade, Western settlers were slow to venture out on Lake Superior. But by the mid-1800s, schooners and steamboats became a common sight as the region's natural resources, particularly vast iron ore deposits, became more valuable. The opening of the Sioux Locks in May 1855, widening the connection between Lake Superior and Lake Huron, greatly expanded access and shipping traffic. Due to its depth, the lake is unusually cold, with water temperatures that hover only just above freezing for most of the year. At higher temperatures, bacteria creates gases that will lift a body to the water's surface. But because the water in Lake Superior is so cold, natural decay is inhibited, and bodies sink to the bottom, usually never to resurface. Lake Superior truly never gives up her dead.
Among the giants of the forest, the standard of comparison is the towering sequoia. Among life insurance companies, the standard of comparison is Northwestern Mutual Life, the quiet company people have been talking about for over 100 years.
Northwestern Mutual began as a simple life insurance company. Founded in 1857 and based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the company began to expand its holdings in the 20th century, making major investments in the iron and mineral industries along the Iron Range west of Lake Superior. The calculation was relatively simple. The company insured many of the businesses and freighters on the Great Lakes. Investing in these industries increased the company's financial standing and further increased its ability to pay out claims without damaging the business. In the 1950s, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company would take it one step further. In 1947, the company named a new president, Edmund Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald's background was more akin to that of a shipping magnate then a life insurance executive. His grandfather and 5 uncles all captained freighters on the Great Lakes. His father was the president of Milwaukee's largest shipyard. He had a lifelong passion for shipping, and in 1957, he made a bold proposal. Northwestern Mutual should build its own lake freighter. The board enthusiastically agreed. They wouldn't just build a lake freighter, they would build the largest, most powerful, and most luxurious freighter the Great Lakes had ever seen. To build this impressive new ship, the company signed a contract with the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan for $8.4 million on February 1st, 1957. The requirements were simple but bold. Build the largest ship possible that could fit through the Sioux locks. They would follow the same basic design that yielded nearly every lake freighter in the last century. A long, boxy cargo hold with a pilot house stuck to the bow and engines tacked onto the stern. A flat bottom made them vulnerable to rolling, and low freeboard made it easy for water to rush over the spar deck. The long, thin design was vulnerable to cracking, and by 1957, plenty of ships already had. Just 1 year later, the Carl D. Bradley, a similarly designed ship, would break in half during a heavy storm, killing 33 of the 35 men on board. It wasn't the best design, as proved by the countless shipwrecks that came before, but it was fantastic for maximizing cargo. With massive loads of limestone, grain, coal, and of course iron ore, each additional ton brought more profit. Safety was a consideration, but profit was the primary concern. They knew how to build stronger, more capable ships. They were everywhere all over the world's oceans. But the lake freighter design built countless fortunes. It was simple, and it was profitable. This new ship would push the design to a larger scale than ever before. The Army Corps of Engineers mandated that the maximum size capable of traversing the MacArthur Locks in Sault Ste. Marie was no more than 750 feet long, 75 feet wide, and drafted no more than 29.5 feet. The new St. Lawrence Seaway would have a similar limit of 729 feet in length. It was unlikely that the new ship would ever need to pass through the new seaway, but it made sense to keep the option open just in case. Work began on yard number 301 on August 7, 1957. Her measurements perfectly matched the limits just outlined. The massive new freighter would be 729 feet or 222 meters long, with a beam of 75 feet or 23 meters, and a typical draft of around 25 feet or 7.6 meters. She would come in at 13,632 gross registered tons, and could carry an impressive 26,000 long tons of cargo. Her 3 cargo holds were loaded through 21 hatches. Each opening was 11 by 48 feet. Her initial power plant consisted of a coal-fired Westinghouse Electric Corporation steam turbine that could produce 7,500 shaft horsepower. An impressive figure for a lake freighter, giving her a speed of around 14 knots. This would later be replaced by oil-fired boilers in winter 1971. Building the new ship went smoothly, and Northwestern Mutual was immensely proud of the project. The only question was what to name the new ship. It had been suggested that the company should follow the tradition of other lake freighter owners and name the new vessel after the company president. But Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't keen on the idea. For one, he was a fairly modest guy who thought it was tacky to slap his name on things. But most of all, he knew the lakes. He was well aware of many of the awful wrecks that had come before. Those names were burned in his mind. He suggested alternatives: Centennial, Seaway, Milwaukee, Northwestern. But the board had their mind set. The president was well loved, and after all, it was a darn good name. He abstained and stepped out of the room. The 36 board members voted unanimously that the new ship would be named Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald was launched on June 7, 1958. The day didn't go quite as planned. Over 15,000 spectators gathered to watch the ceremony, and over 250 recreational boats waited to watch from the water. The first signs of trouble came when Edmund Fitzgerald and his wife Elizabeth tried to christen the new ship. It took 3 tries before they could finally smash the Magnum bottle of champagne over the bow. When it finally broke, the crowd erupted in cheers as whistles blew, signaling the waiting yard workers that it was time to release the keel blocks. Then, nothing happened. The blocks were stuck. It took a full 36 minutes of workers desperately hacking at the wedges before finally, at 12:34 p.m., the massive ship began to move. It slid into the water with enormous force, far more than anyone expected, creating a massive wave that swept over some of the spectators. As it hit the water, the hole didn't stop. It smashed into the pier across from her slipway as if trying to climb out of the water, as one witness recalled, before she finally settled. It wasn't smooth, but the hull was in the water and ready for the next phase of construction. Despite the hiccups, it was a wondrous sight for those who witnessed it, a spectacle that none would soon forget. For one, it was too much. Jennings B. Frazier, a resident of Toledo, Ohio, suffered a heart attack and passed away. It was a dark omen that few dwelled on at the time. For Edmund Fitzgerald, it was probably the happiest day of his life. He was immensely proud of the ship his company created. He retired 2 years later and always cherished the memory of that day. Over the coming days and weeks, workers swarmed the ship, preparing her for service. She would be considerably more comfortable than the average lake freighter. The department store J.L. Hudson was contracted to fit out her crew spaces. Plush carpeting was installed throughout, a major luxury in the 1950s. TVs were installed in various spaces, and her quarters were even air-conditioned. She had 2 finely appointed guest staterooms, complete with tiled bathrooms that would have rivaled the accommodations on most ocean liners at the time. The goal was to build a ship that every sailor on the lakes would want to work on, and they certainly succeeded. Wood and leather furnishings, ample space, windows and light, all set the Fitz apart from other lake freighters. Despite countless shipwrecks in the past, safety regulations at the time were somewhat relaxed. But when she was built, the Fitzgerald was better equipped than most. There were 2 50-man lifeboats over her deck stern house, as well as 2 20-man life rafts stored in the bow. On older lake freighters, the only way to move between the bow and the stern was out on the open spar deck. But the Fitzgerald was designed with 2 interior access tunnels, port and starboard, of her cargo holds. These allowed movements between the 2 ends of the ship even during heavy weather. Below and outboard of her cargo holds were 8 ballast tanks divided at the centerline. These tanks were filled and drained with 4 electronically driven 7,000 gallon per minute ballast pumps. These were backed up by 2 auxiliary pumps that could move 2,000 gallons per minute. These powerful pumps only connected to the aftmost number 3 cargo hold through the ballast manifold. Water could not be pumped directly out of the first 2 cargo holds or the bow. Designers assumed that water would naturally drain aft due to the heavy engine equipment in the stern. Her hatch design was not entirely waterproof, so water in her cargo holds was expected. In theory, her 6 pumps should have been more than enough to manage routine leaks if all went according to plan. But it was well known that a full cargo load could potentially slow the flow of water out of the ship. There was radio telephone equipment in both her pilot house and her chart room. They could be run off of ship power or auxiliary batteries in order to maintain radio contact in the case of an emergency. She had a Mackay Type 4003A radio direction finder. This could measure the distance from fixed locations to establish the ship's position. She had no fathometer, so soundings would need to be taken by hand lead. There were 2 surface scan radar sets on board. One a Sperry Mark III and the other a Sperry Mark 16. Owning a ship and operating it are 2 different things. Northwestern Mutual knew almost nothing of the latter. so their new ship would be contracted out. The Edmund Fitzgerald was managed by the Oglebay Norton Corporation under a 25-year contract. Upon her maiden voyage on September 24, 1958, she was designated the flagship of the company's Columbia Transportation Fleet. When launched, she was the Queen of the Lakes, the unofficial title given to the longest freighter on the Great Lakes. Huge crowds would gather to watch her pass through the locks, and sailors vied for positions on her crew. Dubbed the Mighty Fitz, she became a fixture on the Great Lakes, a symbol of size, power, and prestige. It seemed that the Great Lakes had finally been tamed. The Edmund Fitzgerald was an immediate success. In 1958, her first year of operation, she set a record for the largest cargo carried in a single voyage on the Great Lakes: 22,509 long tons of iron ore. The following year, she would surpass her own record. But the Fitz wouldn't remain Queen of the Lakes for long. Only a little over a year after her launch, the Murray Bay entered service, beating the Fitzgerald's length by just half a foot. Significantly larger vessels would soon follow. In 1960, the Edmund Fitzgerald would get a sister ship, the Arthur B. Homer. While nearly identical and very slightly larger, the Homer never quite reached the same level of prestige. Even as larger ships entered service, the Edmund Fitzgerald continued to compete for record cargo loads. She was a favorite among boat watchers and almost always drew a crowd whenever she passed through the Soo locks, or anywhere else where someone could get a close view. Crews knew that she was especially beloved, and they worked to maintain her appearance, always repainting the name every year to keep the ship looking new. Her reputation only grew when in 1966 she got a new captain, Peter Pulser. He loved the attention his ship commanded and played into it every chance he got. While they passed through the Soo, he would get on the ship's loudspeaker and tell her history or play music. He became known as the DJ Captain and even went on deck dressed as Santa Claus to entertain the families who came out to watch. He was especially beloved by his crew and created one of the most lively and spirited atmospheres of any Great Lakes freighter. When he left the ship in November 1971, command was turned over to Ernest McSorley. A sailor since age 18, by the time McSorley took command of the Fitz, he was one of the most experienced and respected captains on the lakes. After all, he had to be. The Columbia fleet was a powerhouse, and the Fitz was their flagship. There was a reputation to uphold, and most importantly, profit to be made. While the Edmund Fitzgerald had been easily eclipsed in size by newer freighters, she could still generate record profits through the sheer number of times she crossed back and forth on the lakes. McSorley wasn't a showman like Pulser, but he was excellent at selecting and leading crew. His navigational skills were unmatched, and he had the drive to push his ship to the limits in order to maintain her lofty reputation. A deeply private man, few knew that his longtime wife Nellie had suffered a stroke and was living in a nursing home in Toledo. He only barely hinted to a few of his closest friends that he intended to retire so that he could spend more time with her. But until then, he was fully devoted to the Edmund Fitzgerald. In 1969, the ship was given a safety award for going 8 years without any injuries that required time off. Over the years, she experienced a small handful of minor mishaps. She briefly ran aground in 1969. In 1970, she suffered a minor collision with a ship called the Hochelaga. That same year, she struck a wall while passing through the Soo. This happened again in 1973 and 74. 1974 also saw the loss of her bow anchor in the Detroit River. All of these incidents were extremely minor and routine for any ship on the Great Lakes. By 1975, while the Edmund Fitzgerald was subtly beginning to show her age, there was no reason to think that she wouldn't remain a fixture of the lakes well into the next decade and beyond. She underwent her last Coast Guard inspection on October 31st, 1975. The survey found 4 minor structural defects in her hatches. The damage was extremely minor, probably caused by offloading equipment. There was no indication that it affected the integrity of her hull. The damage was ordered to be repaired during her upcoming winter layup in Toledo, but she was cleared to finish out the season. The Edmund Fitzgerald was thought to be just as sound and reliable as she had been for the better part of 2 decades. Now, it was time to finish out the 1975 season. November 9th, 1975, brought beautiful weather to Lake Superior. The air was warm, and the skies were clear. It was about as good as any sailor could hope for that late in the season. The Edmund Fitzgerald sat at the Burlington Ore Docks in Superior, Wisconsin. In just under 6 hours, her 3 cargo holds were filled with 26,116 long tons of taconite ore pellets, 4,000 tons more than the load that earned her a record in her first season. Since 1969, the Coast Guard gradually certified the ship to sail with an ever shallower freeboard, allowing for more cargo. By 1973, she was allowed to sail with 3 feet, 3.25 inches less minimum freeboard than what was called for in her original designs, leaving her spar deck only 11.5 feet above the water during calm seas. But on November 9th, no one would have given that much thought. She was tested, and she was true. Her crew went to work fastening down the hatches and hosing the taconite dust and debris from the deck. As the last hatches were secured at 2:15 p.m., her lines were cast off, and the Edmund Fitzgerald pushed away from the pier. Wheelsman John Simmons turned her nose toward Lake Superior. She soon passed between Minnesota Point and Wisconsin Point and emerged on the open lake. Then, her speed increased to 16.3 miles per hour as she got underway. Just 2.5 hours after the Fitz departed, another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, left Two Harbors, Minnesota, with a full load of taconite pellets bound for Gary, Indiana. Launched in Lorain, Ohio in 1952 and named for a former director of U.S. Steel, the Anderson was actually 38 feet longer than the Fitzgerald, after 120 feet were added to her hull during an overhaul the previous winter. The Anderson was nearly as prestigious as the Fitzgerald, having earned a reputation as one of the finest vessels on the lakes. She was commanded by Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper, a veteran of the lakes with 38 years of experience. Captain Cooper began as a deckhand and worked his way up to third mate before serving in the Navy during World War II. After the war, he continued working his way up the ladder, before finally earning his master's papers. 1975 was his 3rd year in command of the Anderson. As they cleared the breakwater and made their way out on Lake Superior, Captain Cooper soon caught sight of another ship not far behind them on the lake. He knew that it was the Edmund Fitzgerald. Eventually, the faster ship would catch up and overtake them, but they would spend most of their time on Superior within eyesight. This was a comfort to Captain Cooper. A storm brewing in Kansas was initially forecasted to pass south of the lake. But as the day went on, the storm grew more powerful and its course began to shift. An amended forecast predicted that the building system would now pass over the southeast end of Lake Superior. Just as Cooper cleared Two Harbors, the National Weather Service issued a new bulletin, calling for gale force winds. But Captain Cooper wasn't very worried. The bulletin called for winds of around 34 to 38 knots. Nothing all too challenging, and far from the worst that he had faced on the Anderson. He knew his ship could handle it. Plus, with the Edmund Fitzgerald steaming up behind them, they wouldn't be alone. He didn't know Ernest McSorley personally, but he knew the Fitz. They were both trusted as weather reporting ships, outfitted with monitoring equipment. 4 times a day they would report their readings to the National Weather Service. These reports helped the service monitor and track weather out on the lakes. Captain Cooper called Captain McSorley to discuss the coming weather. For now, neither captain was inclined to change their ship's course. They should pass Isle Royale around the time that the first bands of the storm would be hitting. The island would give them shelter in case conditions turned out worse than expected. But unless something drastic changed, they should be fine. For now, the weather was calm and pleasant. But by the evening, things began to change as winds grew stronger and the waves grew choppy. Inside the Fitz, most of the crew barely even noticed. The storm in November was business as usual. By midnight, they would reach the southern end of Isle Royale, and sometime in the night, they would pass the Anderson. At 1 a.m., they transmitted their regular weather report. They were 20 miles south of Isle Royale. The temperature had dropped to 37 degrees. The wind was reaching 52 knots. 10-foot waves crashed into their hull. Blinding rain brought visibility down to around 2 to 4 miles. The barometer only continued to fall. The storm was now over central Wisconsin and barreling toward Lake Superior at 33 miles per hour. Just 1 hour after the Fitzgerald sent her report, the Weather Service issued a storm warning calling for northeast winds 25 to 50 knots, becoming northwesterly 28 to 38 knots, with waves 8 to 15 feet. Even at the time, this seemed a conservative estimate. The storm was building fast. But the 2 captains weren't worried. Both the Anderson and the Fitzgerald were riding well. For Captain Cooper, this was nothing he hadn't seen before, and he knew that his ship could handle it. They phoned each other once again and agreed that a more northerly course would be the best. There, the ships would enjoy some shelter from the coast of Ontario. It would add a few hours to the voyage, but conditions only seemed to be getting worse, and this change would make things a little bit easier. At 7 a.m., Captain McSorley contacted his company offices in Cleveland for a routine update. He reported that because of the storm, their ETA at the Sioux was indefinite. After a rough morning, by 1 p.m. on November 10, 1975, the storm began to let up. Lake Superior calmed, and slivers of sunlight even crept through the clouds. The turn north shielded the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson from the worst of the storm. Now, only an hour before the skies cleared, the 2 ships turned south, back to the open lake on their way to the Sioux Locks. The Fitzgerald had overtaken the Anderson at around 3 a.m. that morning, but the 2 ships were still within sight of each other. No one was fooled by the lull in the storm. They knew how these systems worked, and how the rotating winds created an eye of relative calm. The winds would soon shift, and they would face the worst of it. Right on schedule at 1:50 p.m., the wind picked up once again to over 50 miles per hour and climbing. By 2:45, a wall of heavy snowfall swept over the lake, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Soon, the Edmund Fitzgerald, only around 16 miles ahead of the Anderson, fell out of view. Captain Cooper would never see the ship again. What exactly happened in the next few hours will probably never be known. The moment the Arthur M. Anderson left the eye, the storm exploded in strength and severity. What started as a relatively routine November storm turned into something that rivaled the most infamous storms in the history of the Great Lakes. Captain Cooper kept an eye on the Fitzgerald on his radar screen. He directed his ship to pass further west of Michipicoten Island than the Fitzgerald had. Cooper chose his path carefully, wanting to put as much space between his ship and the 6-fathom shoals near Caribou Island as possible. The Fitzgerald, however, now running around 15 miles ahead and hidden by the blinding snow, seemed to be passing significantly closer to the shoals. Cooper and his first mate, Morgan Clark, watched with concern on their radar screen as their fellow ship passed dangerously close to the shoals. It might have been okay, but it was significantly closer than Cooper would have felt comfortable taking his own ship. Not long after, at 3:35 p.m., he got a call from Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald. "I've got problems," said McSorley. "I've got a fence rail down, some fence torn off, and I got a bad list." Cooper asked if he had his pumps going. McSorley replied, "Yes, both of them." Then McSorley asked if Anderson would shadow them the rest of the way down the lake. He would reduce his speed so they could catch up. Cooper told him that they would do their best, and the two signed off. He didn't quite know what to make of what McSorley told him. With how close the Fitz passed to the shoals, he almost expected to hear that they grounded, but McSorley sounded only mildly concerned. Cooper wondered what could have damaged the ship's fencing. It would have taken more than heavy waves to take down these rails. Something would have had to hit them. Or, perhaps, they could be brought down by excessive hogging, putting extreme tension on the wires. This could have been caused by bending from the tumultuous seas, or from striking a shoal, briefly lifting the center of the ship while the weight of the bow and the stern pulled down at either end, exacting enormous strain on the hull. Cooper was more convinced than ever that the Fitzgerald might have struck bottom, but he couldn't be sure, and for now he had his own ship to worry about, especially as the Anderson herself passed by Caribou Island. The storm was quickly spiraling out of control. The waves grew larger, cresting at 10 to 15 feet. The wind grew more intense, easily exceeding 60 miles per hour. Soon, the Coast Guard sent out a dire warning to all ships, telling them that the Sioux was closed and anyone still out on Lake Superior should immediately seek shelter. At 4:10 p.m., the Anderson received another call from the Fitzgerald. With Captain Cooper momentarily away from the pilot house, First Mate Morgan Clark took the call. McSorley told him that they had lost both of their radars and he was sailing blind. He asked if the Anderson could assist with navigation. Clark immediately agreed. The storm must have knocked out the Fitzgerald's radar antennas. Still hours away from Whitefish Point and with the storm only growing worse, sailing blind could be a death sentence. Captain McSorley made a number of other calls during this period. Probably not wanting to rely only on the Anderson, which could lose her own radar just as easily. McSorley attempted to get a bearing on the Whitefish Point lighthouse using his radio direction finder, but unknown to him, the storm had knocked out the station's electricity. The light and navigation equipment was down. He contacted the Coast Guard in Grand Marais, Michigan to ask if the navigation beacon was operational. But Gary Wiggin, the radio man on duty, wasn't sure, and he asked McSorley to stand by. He would call him back as soon as he could find out. Growing increasingly desperate, McSorley put out a call to any ships in the Whitefish Point area to report on the state of the navigational aids. Finally, at around 5 p.m., he got a hold of Captain Cedric Woodward on the 490-foot Swedish ship Avafors, which was sailing in the opposite direction and was just passing by Whitefish Point. Captain Woodward knew Captain McSorley well, but at first he didn't recognize his voice. It was almost as if he had a bad cold, or, more likely, had not gotten enough sleep. Either way, it wasn't his normal voice. During their conversation, he heard McSorley shout, "Don't allow nobody on deck." He heard other sounds of commotion, and thought he heard someone say something about a vent, but he couldn't be sure. Woodward stepped out on deck to get a better look at the nearby Whitefish Point lighthouse. He could see the tower, but the light was dark. He reported what he saw to McSorley. Soon after, Wiggins called McSorley back and confirmed that the station was down. Wiggins' story differs slightly from Woodward. He was also familiar with the captain, but he thought McSorley sounded completely normal, and the situation on board the Fitzgerald was easily under control. Not long after, Woodward called again to report that the Whitefish Point lighthouse had turned back on. McSorley replied, "I'm glad to hear it." Woodward asked how they were getting on. McSorley said, "We are taking on heavy seas over our decks. It's the worst sea I have ever been in. We have a bad list and no radar." They finished their call, and McSorley returned his focus to making the mad dash for the safety of Whitefish Point. Unfortunately, the reprieve was short-lived. Only moments after his call with Woodward, the light failed once again. McSorley was searching for a beacon that wasn't there. Back on the Arthur M. Anderson, the situation had gone from bad to apocalyptic. The wind was holding steady at 65 to 70 miles per hour, with gusts reaching as high as 100 miles per hour. Quartering seas were breaking over the Anderson's starboard side, walls of water that smashed over her towering pilot house. As the afternoon turned to early evening, the two ships continued to keep in contact. "We haven't got far to go. We will soon have it made," Morgan Clark told McSorley. They were only about 60 to 90 minutes away from Whitefish Point, but every minute felt like an eternity as the storm unleashed hell on the two ships. Captain Cooper couldn't believe how fast the conditions had deteriorated. Now, he was doing everything he could to keep his ship on course. Fortunately, the Anderson seemed to be holding up, but every wave that washed over the freighter felt like it could be a death sentence. Suddenly, at around 6:30 p.m., Captain Cooper was nearly knocked off his feet when a massive rogue wave slammed into his stern, completely washing over the aft deck housing. The wave had been an incredible 35 to 40 feet tall. It washed down the length of the spar deck before crashing into the pilot house. Then, only a few moments later, another wave just as big smashed into them. For just a moment, the pilot house was completely underwater before the massive ship heaved them back above the waves. It was nothing short of a miracle that the Anderson survived at all. Now, Captain Cooper feared that those same waves were heading straight for the ailing Edmund Fitzgerald, only a few miles away. At 7:10 p.m., First Mate Morgan Clark on the Arthur M. Anderson made another call to the Edmund Fitzgerald. Their radar had picked up an upbound ship approximately 19 miles away that would pass close to the struggling freighter. After telling him about the oncoming ship, Clark asked McSorley how they were making out with their problems. McSorley responded, "We are holding our own." They were the final words that anyone would hear from the 29 souls aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. But nobody knew that at the time. Captain Cooper's focus remained on getting his ship to the safety of Whitefish Point. At around this time, the storm began to ease. The reprieve was slight, but the worst was over. The snow had stopped, and there were even breaks in the clouds. In the distance, Cooper saw the lights of 3 ships leaving Whitefish Bay. They were all Salties, ships not designed for the Great Lakes, but the open ocean. The Nanfree, Benfree, and the Avafors. What he didn't see was another lake freighter. By this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald should only be a few miles ahead of them, easily within visual range. But the great ship had vanished from his radar screen, and as he scanned the darkness, he saw nothing. It was possible that the Fitz merely suffered a power failure and was drifting somewhere nearby in the darkness. But with each passing moment, a growing sense of dread swept through the pilot house. Cooper tried calling the Fitz, but he received no reply. He hoped that maybe his radio wasn't working, but when he called out to other vessels, the William Clay Ford, another freighter anchored in Whitefish Bay, responded immediately. Cooper asked if the Fitz had somehow made it to the bay, but no one on the Ford had seen her. The reality of what just happened finally began to wash over Captain Cooper. He turned his radio to channel 16, the distress frequency, and called the Coast Guard station in Sault Ste. Marie. But the station's radio equipment had been damaged in the storm. He was told to call back on channel 12 to keep the emergency channel open. To his amazement, the Coast Guard did not seem concerned at all, and they brushed off their report. Instead, the Coast Guard asked if Anderson could help keep a lookout for a 16-foot pleasure boat that went missing in the storm. Cooper wasn't satisfied. 38 minutes later, he called again. This time, he was far more urgent.
When I was talking to him, he was 15 miles from the land. So, Phil, I said you had him visually and on the radar, and you lost him in both respects. No, I didn't have him visually. I had him on the radar. He was exactly 10 miles ahead of us. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that.
Finally, at around 9 p.m., his report was taken seriously. But there was no search and rescue craft anywhere near the area that could help respond. Incredibly, the Coast Guard asked Captain Cooper if the Anderson could go back and search for the missing ship. Bernie Cooper had just endured the most harrowing few hours of his entire career on the lakes. His ship held up well, but for a few perilous moments it was touch and go. The last thing that he wanted to do was put his ship and his shaken crew through the same ordeal. But then he thought about his fellow sailors on the Fitz. If it was his ship, he knew that they would come back for him. He had to do it. He ordered his ship to reverse course and head back out on Lake Superior. They were soon joined by the William Clay Ford. Another vessel sheltering in Whitefish Bay, the Hilda Marjane, tried to join but couldn't overcome the rough weather. Throughout the evening, the two freighters searched for their missing cousin. They were eventually joined by a Coast Guard HU-16 fixed-wing search aircraft from Traverse City, Michigan. And at 1 a.m., an HH-52 Coast Guard helicopter with a 3.8 million candle power searchlight arrived on the scene. The buoy tender Wood Rush was sent from Duluth, but they wouldn't arrive until the following day. It was all in vain. The Edmund Fitzgerald and the 29 men on board were never found. By the early morning hours, everyone knew that it was a lost cause. Even if someone had managed to escape the sinking ship, they wouldn't survive the brutality of the storm out on the open lake. Not long after daylight crept over Lake Superior, the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson spotted something floating in the distance. As they drew closer, their worst fears were confirmed. It was the shattered remains of a lifeboat, clearly labeled Edmund Fitzgerald. Badly damaged, there was no way that the boat was launched properly. It had to have been violently ripped from the freighter as she made a violent plunge to the bottom. The mighty Fitz was gone. Her end came quickly and violently. Captain Cooper knew that only a little over 12 hours before, only a few miles away from him, 29 lives had been claimed by Lake Superior. The oldest man on the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night of November 10, 1975, was 63-year-old Captain Ernest McSorley. The youngest was a deckhand, Mark Thomas, just 21 years old. For some, the Edmund Fitzgerald was just another chapter in a lifetime on the lakes. More than one of these men planned to retire when the season came to an end. Robert Rafferty was already more or less retired when he joined the ship for his final voyage because one of the regular cooks fell ill. For others, their time on the ship was supposed to be brief, just a season or two to earn some money and plan the next phase of their life. Deckhands Paul Ripa and Bruce Hudson were 22. Oiler Thomas Benson was 23. All just kids, barely out of school. Young and old, their fate was all the same. Over the coming days, numerous pieces of debris were found throughout the southeast end of Lake Superior, including the other heavily damaged lifeboat. But no bodies or signs of the crew were found. Lake Superior truly never gives up her dead. It didn't take long before a U.S. Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft detected the wreck of the great ship on November 14, 1975. She lies 530 feet under the surface, 17 miles from the entrance to Whitefish Bay, just over the international boundary on the Canadian side. Her hull is broken in two. The wreck has been studied and numerous investigations and inquiries have poured over every detail of what might have happened that night. But still, no one knows for sure exactly what sank the Edmund Fitzgerald. The theories are numerous and in-depth, enough to easily quadruple the length of this already long video. I'll leave it to others to explore them in more detail. But there are two things that we know for sure. One, something happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald after the Anderson lost visual contact that caused her to begin taking on water. The second is that she sank quickly and violently, plunging to the bottom in only minutes. Her crew had almost no time to react, no time to send a distress call, and no time to launch a lifeboat. It's almost impossible to know what exactly caused the flooding and when it started. The Coast Guard investigation into the tragedy caused outrage when they placed the blame on improperly secured hatches. But there's little evidence to support this finding, and in recent years, it has fallen out of favor. Others have looked at the integrity of her hull and the possibility that, like the Carl D. Bradley, she broke apart on the surface. The Fitzgerald was aging, and there's no doubt that she was pushed hard. The increasingly shallow freeboard allowed by the Coast Guard put additional stress on her hull that her original designers never accounted for. Early in her career, she was known to ride well, even in tough conditions. But as her load limits were increased, she became noticeably more sluggish, slow to respond, and slow to recover. Her bow sometimes hooked to one side or the other, and her hull groaned loudly. Captain McSorley told a friend that the ship did a wiggling thing that scared him. Some involved in her construction claimed that the methods used to build the ship were not up to par. And in 1980, her sister ship, the Arthur B. Homer, was abruptly pulled from service. No official explanation was given, but it's suspected that there were structural issues found in her hull that the company allegedly wished to hide. She was scrapped in '87. Captain Bernie Cooper was convinced that the Edmund Fitzgerald hit a shoal as she passed by Caribou Island. It's possible that in the chaos of the storm, the crew might not have even realized that it happened. But the resulting damage would explain the increasingly severe list that Captain McSorley reported in their final hours. It was later found that the 1973 charts that were used at the time were inaccurate. A later study found that the 6-fathom shoal actually ran approximately 1 mile further east than what was recorded. According to what Captain Cooper observed on his radar, the Fitzgerald already passed dangerously close to where the shoal was thought to be in 1975. Even a minor grounding could put enormous strain on the ship in such punishing conditions. But it was something that the Fitzgerald might have been able to survive. She was, after all, only a few miles from shelter. many believe that the final blow came from a rogue wave, possibly the same ones that struck the Anderson not long before the Fitz vanished from radar. On Lake Superior, there's a phenomenon called the Three Sisters, when 3 rogue waves come in quick succession, each one larger than the last. Captain Cooper remembered 2 huge waves smashing over the Anderson. It's possible that in the chaos he missed the third, or it somehow missed the ship. Whether it was 3 waves or 1, the Fitzgerald was already struggling. Listing badly, wave after wave washed over her spar deck. This was green water that pushed the ship down and speeded her flooding. Then, out of nowhere, a massive rogue wave, maybe up to 40 feet high, smashed into her, lifting her stern high and pushing her bow deep into the water. The force would have driven her straight to the bottom. The impact strong enough to rip the ship in 2. For the 29 men on board, it would have been more like a plane crash than a sinking ship. In less than a minute, everything around them exploded in a torrent of water. No matter the exact cause, the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald exposed a culture of complacency and insufficient safety regulations on the Great Lakes. In the years that followed, a number of new regulations were introduced. All ships over 1,600 tons now had to carry depth finders. Positioning systems and emergency beacons are now required. Survival suits must be placed in cabins and crew spaces. Charts have been updated, and weather forecasting is more accurate and taken more seriously. The Coast Guard no longer permits reduced freeboard limits, and every ship must be fully inspected in the fall. The Edmund Fitzgerald was the last major shipwreck on the Great Lakes. For over a century, countless ships lost the same battle. Many of them became household names in the area. Dramatic stories of struggle and loss, immeasurable tragedies caused by an inhuman lust for profit, a callous disregard for human life that left countless young men at the bottom of those mighty inland seas. But something about the Edmund Fitzgerald was different. While you rarely hear about the Cedarville, or the Carl D. Bradley, the D.M. Clemson, or the Daniel J. Morrell, the Edmund Fitzgerald is everywhere. Like the Titanic, the ill-fated freighter has become an industry on its own. Books, tours, TV specials, YouTube videos like the one you're watching now. It's a story that commands attention. A drama so compelling, it's almost easy to forget that the men on board weren't just characters in a gripping story. They were living, breathing people, just like you and me. They had hopes, dreams, ambitions, plans for what they would do the next day. They had families and friends who loved them, and fought to make sure that they would be the last lost on the lakes. Every one of us contains an entire world. When we lose a ship like the Edmund Fitzgerald, it rips a tiny hole in the universe, leaving a million wounds that, even 50 years later, have yet to fully heal.